Okay, welcome back. In our last episode, we talked about the sheer chaos that existed in Europe following the close of the Second World War. It was not a pretty picture anywhere, but in the East, in Soviet-controlled territory, things were much grimmer. If you look at a map of, Europe, I guess, all the way through the Cold War, all of the territories that the Soviets are going to control or dominate were pretty much where their armies happened to be at the close of the war. It's almost just they decided not to go home. Stalin, at this point, immediately following the war, wanted to make Soviet communism into something that people would welcome. So he allowed things to really slip off the rails in a big way. In a way that the lawlessness that exists at this particular time reminds you of that movie, The Purge. People are settling scores left and right. It was very common for actual former prisoners to run concentration camps, and for those same prisoners to rule over ex-Nazis, or in most cases suspected ex-Nazis, because, well, ironically, Nazis were very hard to find after the end of the war. There is a story of told by a British lieutenant who happened to be traveling in Germany near a city named Wesel. He describes this particular event that he saw. Quote, "I saw two men ahead, a Russian making his way to Wesel and an old German walking with a walking stick, moving slowly towards the station. As we approached, the men stopped, the Russian apparently asking the time, because the old man removed a chain pocket watch from his waistcoat pocket. In a combined movement, the Russian snatched the watch and plunged a long-bladed knife into the German's chest. The old man staggered and fell backwards into the ditch. When we drew up, his feet were in the air and his trouser legs slipped down, showing two thin white calves. The Russian had pulled the knife and was calmly wiping the blood from the blade on the old man's coat when I rammed the muzzle of my revolver into his ribs. When the Russian was standing on the road with his hands in the air, I gave the revolver to Patrick, whilst I jumped down into the ditch to help the victim. The old man was dead. The Russian, an inarticulate brute, looked down at me kneeling by the body without a trace of emotion or remorse. I took possession of the knife and the watch, and then pushed him into the back of the truck and sat facing him with the revolver. We went to the military government office to hand him to Captain Grubb, but he was out. We took the prisoner to Kasarne so he could be dealt with accordingly with Soviet law. I flung the prisoner into the leader's room by the scruff of the neck and accused him of murder, producing the knife and the watch. One of the leaders, who identified himself as the administrator, the Russian word is the same as English, came forward. "You say this man killed a German?" he asked with a smile. I showed him the murder weapon. He moved across to a colleague and removed a red star from his cap, then pinned it on the murderer's breast and kissed him on the cheek. The murderer of the old man wearing his decoration slipped out of the room and lost himself among the hundreds in the barracks. I never set eyes on him again. End quote. In addition to this sort of lawlessness, I would say one thing really typified Soviet policy in this period, and that is going to be the forced movement of huge swaths of people. During this period, you're talking something north of 3, maybe 4 million people are going to be moved from their homelands to different places within the Soviet Empire. People particularly suspect would be people that maybe were thought to have collaborated with the Germans. So, if you lived in Estonia or Latvia, Lithuania, the Poles really got it, but Ukrainians as well. This is something that the Soviets had been doing for a long time during the numerous purges and the campaign against the kulaks. People are going to be deported to Siberia, not just to work in labor camps, but they'll actually forcibly settle them. Some people that you really wouldn't even imagine. Almost 200,000 Koreans living in the Soviet Union, sort of along near the border of Korea, were forcibly deported to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, which many of them, their descendants are still there today. This is a time-honored, effective way to cow a populace. I mean, it's nothing new. In the 7th century BC, the Assyrians used to take whole nations and just move them clear across the empire. I mean, whole nations, like everyone living in a certain geographical area. They would just, all of them would be up and gone. And then they'd be replaced by some other group from the other side of the empire, and they would just sort of move people around like some sort of a shell game. They felt that, away from familiar places, the spirits of their national gods would sort of stay where they'd left them. And the new gods are their masters. And that's all that counted now. There's a city named Khorsabad that was literally a purpose-built multinational city. It was just built from nothing during the reign of Sargon II. And it's sort of like a Tower of Babel in reverse. It's like all these different ethnic groups are all just thrown together in one place, and it's like, okay, good luck. If you know anything about the Old Testament, you think about the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The Assyrians invade, and all of these Hebrews. 10 out of the 12 tribes are just gone, and nobody sees them again. They're going to be forcibly deported to the east, where they're never heard of again. So it's going to be the Poles and the Ukrainians in this particular instance that have a very difficult experience. Keith Lowe sort of describes it, quote, "The one experience that united all these people, and indeed all of the millions of others who were displaced from their lands after the Second World War, was the desire to return home. This, however, was the one act forbidden above all others. Those who tried to return to their villages in Galicia found themselves faced with angry militiamen and were threatened with violence or imprisonment. For others, there was simply no point. In the absence of the communities they had grown up with, their villages were no longer idealized places that they remembered. When Olga Zaganovich tried to visit Grazoiwa, many years later, she found nothing there. The village had been burnt. It didn't exist anymore." End quote. The human tragedy of what is occurring behind this Iron Curtain, as Churchill calls it, is very often overlooked. I think historians sort of really concentrate on World War II, and it's almost like there's just been so much chaos and violence. You want to get back to some sort of normalcy, and the idea that it's just sort of a continuation of all of the misery that's been happening for all of these years. It doesn't sit well. You want a narrative that just sort of can be wrapped up in a nice little bow and then move on to the next story. But reality just doesn't really work that way. Well, as it was, the peoples of Eastern Europe simply had to cope with life under this new regime. Some did it better than others. The United States and now NATO couldn't help these people. They could only hope to contain their masters from subjugating other people. The Truman Doctrine made this into a palpable reality. So economic aid flowed into Western Europe via the Marshall Plan, which we discussed in the last episode. The idea is that happy and well-fed people would be less likely to fall into communism. Stalin, of course, meanwhile, is only going to tighten his grip on power. I've read that it's only, I think, in 1952 or 53 that the Gulag population, the Soviet forced labor camps, which had existed all the way back to the Russian Revolution. There's a lot of evidence that when Hitler designs his own concentration camps, he's basically going to utilize the Soviet model. By 1953, there'll be 2.4 million people in these camps. Well, today, this episode, the Cold War gets a shot in the arm as America grows increasingly fearful, not only of communism abroad, but also at home. The Soviets seem to be closing this technological gap that's formed, and many fear that they'll take advantage of that. Of course, the Soviets now have the hydrogen bomb, and in this episode, we'll see they will develop the technology to put that bomb right on American soil. The game is going to get more dangerous than ever, this time on Savage Continent. Pretty interesting that both sides during this time period would not hesitate to equate the other with the defeated enemy. It's almost like the myth of Hitler just sort of grows. For communists, I guess before the war, the word imperialist had always been thrown sort of at the capitalist West. Communist ideology preached that the West was run by these warmongering plutocrats. But now you begin to see the word fascist. It's going to be thrown into the equation. This sort of makes sense since the belief was that the political systems of Nazi Germany and then fascist Italy, and I'm going to keep them sort of separate because their political ideologies were a bit distinct. Anyway, they were part of this evolution of capitalism along the road to its eventual demise, after which would follow the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then finally, hopefully, communism, and then a classless society. Historian Keith Lowe writes, quote, "Their denunciations of the West followed the same pattern as American denunciations of communism. Stalin gave interviews to Pravda where he directly compared Churchill to Hitler. His foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, called America a fascicizing power, while other senior members of the party, like Andrei Vyshinsky and Georgy Malenkov, said Americans were imitators of fascist barbarians. As in America, the Soviet leadership used this new threat both as an excuse and a distraction, and as a way to urge their people to unify them behind them once again, just as they had done during the war. In the meantime, anyone with links to the West was immediately denounced. The witch hunts began almost as soon as the war was over. The first people to fall foul of these were returning prisoners of war, along with civilians that had been forcibly removed to Germany during the war to work as slave laborers. Such people had spent long periods living in the midst of the enemy, often followed by more time amongst the British or Americans. Though there are no accurate figures of how many returning prisoners of war were sent to the Gulag, it is certainly tens of thousands. Alexander Solzhenitsyn describes how the labor camps were filled with these people in the aftermath of war. At the same time, 60,000 communists who had been captured by the Germans during the war found themselves expelled from the party." End quote. I think what's even more interesting is that in America, the same thing is sort of happening. The Nazi threat is simply replaced by communism. The ideas are just sort of swapped. Stalin is just another Hitler. Malenkov is just maybe another Heinrich Himmler. Lo goes on to write, quote, "Red fascism was a phrase regularly used by newspapers, politicians, and the FBI, as though the ideologies of Stalin and Hitler were interchangeable. In the same way, Nazism and communism were often conflated into a single term, totalitarianism, a conflation that is still regularly made today. Stalin was sometimes called the Russian Hitler, and politicians spoke of the dangers of appeasing him, just as the British tried to appease Hitler in 1938. Remember Munich," H.V. Kallenborn warned his radio listeners in March 1946. Communist propaganda was compared to Goebbels' propaganda. Soviet gulags were compared to Nazi concentration camps, and the NKVD were compared to the Gestapo. According to the American ambassador to Poland, Arthur Bliss Lane, the same terror of a knock on the door in the dead of night exists today as it did in the Nazi occupation. Such suppression and terror, he told a radio audience in 1947, was just as horrible whether they are permitted under the emblem of the swastika or under the emblem of the hammer and sickle. One future U.S. congressman even compared Marx's Communist Manifesto to Mein Kampf. The comparison between Soviets and Nazis was made everywhere by everyone, even the president. There isn't any difference between the totalitarian Russian government and the Hitler government, Truman told a news conference in March 1950. They are all alike. They are all police state governments. End quote. So think about it this way. I mean, like, the worst thing you can call somebody now is a Nazi, right? But in this time period, calling someone a communist is basically the same thing as calling them a Nazi, because the terms are, again, interchangeable. So if you are anyone on the American political left at this point, you have to feel like you have moved into the crosshairs. A lot of people from the previous administration, the Franklin Roosevelt administration, came into office when New Deal progressivism was in vogue. Eventually, Roosevelt himself is going to know it's a problem. I mean, the whole reason that Harry Truman gets nominated to be vice president in 1944 was the fear that his predecessor was too far on the left. So Henry Wallace is vice president between 1940 and 44. He's going to get swapped out at like the last minute at the party convention in 1944. He's going to stick around. He's going to run in 1948 as a third party candidate for the Progressive Party. He's going to be endorsed by the American Communist Party. Yes, there is one. The American Federation of Labor is actually going to denounce him as a, quote, front spokesperson and apologist for the American Communist Party, end quote. He's going to walk away with less than 3% of the popular vote. There is this prevailing belief, and it sort of grows over time, that, you know, not only are communists a threat abroad, but they're active right here at home. But for the most part, they don't announce themselves in public. There's going to be a couple really important, I guess, communists that get exposed. I mean, the ones that come to mind are, it's going to be the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They're these two scientists that they're going to spy on the Manhattan Project. They're going to give these sort of nuclear secrets to the Soviets, and they're going to be instrumental in helping the Soviets get their own atomic bomb. But then you also have the case of Alger Hiss, who was a senior State Department official that is going to be accused of sending documents like directly to the Soviets during the 1930s. And he's supposed to have been a member of the Communist Party. And this is now inside of the government. And, as any witch hunt, it just sort of expands in all directions. I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about McCarthyism because it's something that's pretty well covered. I mean, there's a lot of great, articles, YouTube videos and everything. But his story really shows you what can happen when you get an opportunistic person who's really trying to make a name for himself that is just sort of able to capitalize on this sort of underlying fear and hysteria. And it's like you need the two things to work together in order to create, what we call a witch hunt. Historian Paul Johnson writes, a fortnight after his conviction, the junior senator for Wisconsin, Joseph R. McCarthy, made a Lincoln Day speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, in which he caused a sensation by waving a piece of paper naming all the men in the State Department who were active members of the Communist Party and members of Aspiring. He added, I have here in my hand a list of 205, a list of names, which were made known to the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, and who nonetheless are working and shaping policy in the state government, end quote. Now, by this point, there has already been a process that's been going on for a number of years where actual, real, legitimate communists were purged from the government. So by the time you get to this McCarthy era, there really were no actual communists. We don't even know what information he was really going off of, but it seems that there was a number of people who were thought to be possible security risks. And McCarthy, for whatever reason, decided to maintain that, okay, but these are active members of the Communist Party. He's just sort of making it up as he goes along. But the thing is, I don't know. He's getting so much attention at the time that he's just glorying in the spotlight. And while he's holding this list, it's just like everybody's eating out of his hands. He's like the most feared man in Washington. I mean, you could probably imagine the way it's going to end for McCarthy. I mean, he's not going to be able to actually finger any communists, and eventually he's going to self-destruct on his own. But this whole era is going to see so many people who were completely innocent just totally thrown under the bus. A lot of people's lives are going to be ruined. And, this is cancel culture. This is what cancel culture does. It's only in time that we were like, okay, no, that person wasn't guilty of this or that. But, there's this mob mentality. I think what's really fortunate is that the people in charge, and I'm going to say Truman and Eisenhower, just really did not buy into any of the hysteria. Historian Paul Johnson writes, Truman told the press that McCarthy was, quote, the Kremlin's greatest asset in America, which was true. Truman also commissioned a study of hysteria and witch hunting in American history, which concluded there was a permanent undercurrent of hate and intolerance in America, which periodically produced outbreaks such as McCarthyism. This, in turn, created an academic sub-branch of sociology, leading to a 1954 Columbia University seminar on McCarthyism, during which the historian Richard Hofstadter, using Theodore Adorno's 1950 tract, The Authoritarian Personality, explained the phenomenon as a projection onto society, the groundless fears of pseudo-conservatives, end quote. Now, think about it this way. If we had someone like a Joseph Stalin running the United States, I mean, he would have eaten this up. I mean, there would have been another purge. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Now, the new inhabitant of the White House, Dwight Eisenhower, he's a very rational man. I really like Eisenhower. He really has a plan for what he wants to do with the country. In his mind, the whole point of American democracy is that government is supposed to be limited. Under Truman, the size of the government had grown, taxes had gone up, and if you create an environment like that, really, what's the point? For Eisenhower, the real problem is the defense budget. During Truman's second term, defense spending had doubled. During the 1950s, a lot of money is going to get spent on defense, a much greater portion than anything in recent history. Ike really wanted a better way. Back to his, being a rational person. Apparently he was, and I did mention this before, he was an amazing card player. Historian Evan Thomas in Ike's Bluff, a nice biography of Eisenhower, portrays Eisenhower's foreign policy in light of his skills as a card player. As a young officer, he was actually so good at poker that he was banned from playing because he was taking so much money from people. When he got older, he became a bridge player, and I talked about bridge in the first episode, sort of how it works. It's this game where you really have to sort of use what limited evidence you have about your opponent, but the limited evidence you have about the partner that you have. You have to work with a partner. It involves complex strategy. It involves teamwork. And it really sort of, Ike apparently was great at calculating risk. He was great at dealing with that accordingly. When it comes to defense policy, he is going to see nuclear weapons as actually the most cost-effective solution to the nation's foreign policy programs. It's about at this time that you start seeing a really complicated and fascinating ideas enter the world of this nuclear warfighting. You're going to get this non-profit independent group called the RAND Corporation. RAND just meant research and development. They are going to start to turn heads in the defense community. Again, it just sort of fits Eisenhower's personality that, he would take this group of like nerds and say like, look, why don't you guys deal with the problem? And these guys are nerds, total nerds, but they're sort of like fascinating outside the box type of nerds. Like if you have a 1950s version of Steve Jobs and you gave him the task of planning a nuclear war, like you get one of these guys. I think you get what I'm saying. One guy is named John von Neumann, and in his day, he was called the smartest man who ever lived. He developed something called game theory, in which players make rational choices based on systematic probability. This could be used to predict maybe how the Soviet regime might handle a geopolitical crisis, or how they would respond, and then how you respond in response to that. There is a guy by the name of Albert Wohlstetter. He's this brilliant mathematician. He developed a logistical plan to protect SAC assets from a first Soviet strike by using overseas bases for only refueling, and then keeping the U.S. planes on the American mainland, and then somehow he cuts a third of the costs in the process. Then there is Bernard Brodie. He's going to be called the American Clausewitz. He's instrumental behind the concept of deterrence. David Kaufman, he's going to come up with the idea of a counterforce that would basically aim U.S. nuclear weapons at Soviet nuclear weapons to sort of disarm them. So instead of having to blow up all of these cities, you could actually just target your weapons at the enemy's weapons and, possibly save a bunch of lives on both sides. Finally, my favorite guy by the name of Herman Kahn. He is sort of the master on the idea of how conflicts can escalate and de-escalate. He's going to become a household name with a book called On Thermonuclear War. He's going to be the guy. I don't know if anybody's seen the movie Dr. Strangelove. Like the weird guy in the wheelchair. That's going to be based on this guy. Okay, so Eisenhower has a lot to contend with. Berlin is still a potential flashpoint. China looks like it may want to expand into Taiwan. You still have to unwind this very sticky Korea situation. Right away, there's a crisis in Egypt where Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president, ejects the British and the French from the Suez Canal area, and he looks like he might want to go pro-Soviet. And then, of course, after the Israel-Palestine war, NATO doesn't look so appealing anymore in the Middle East. The collapse of French Indochina looks like it might spell trouble, and it certainly will in the next decade. Just think Vietnam. I don't think he was initially aware, but Cuba is going to be a real problem. And then India, they look like they might not be too reliable. Of course, colonialism is ending in Africa. There's big concerns there, especially in the Congo. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. I mean, I don't want to get too into the weeds with this foreign policy because it really doesn't concern us that much here. Just know this is when we see the policy of deterrence attain the level of, I guess you could say it's like a dogma for America. The United States will have to threaten to use nuclear force to deter other states from embarking on a certain course of action. This is a great strategy if it works. Of course, in order for it to work, the other side has to believe that you are really going to pull the trigger. This is what's called a credible deterrent. Think about it this way, okay? When you tell your kids, you better stop fighting, or I'm going to pull this car over and come back there, if they don't believe you will actually do it, or worse, if they don't think that your wrath is bad enough to desist punching each other in the ribs, then your deterrence has failed. Of course, when the basis for your deterrence is a nuclear attack, then the stakes are much, much higher. And just in case you're curious, my deterrence policy with my 4 and 5-year-old, deterrence is still credible. I'm not sure with the youngest one. But then again, he's only about 3 weeks old as of this recording, so I guess that remains to be seen. Now, Eisenhower did not have a death wish. Threatening to use nuclear weapons to him was just something that was expedient. In reality, he was absolutely appalled by the destructive power of thermonuclear weapons. John Lewis Gaddis writes this: "The physical effects of thermonuclear weapons appalled him just as much as they did Malenkov and Churchill. Atomic war will destroy civilization," he insisted several months after the Castle Bravo test. "There will be millions of people dead. If the Kremlin and Washington ever lock up in a war, the results will be too horrible to contemplate." When told early in 1956 that a Soviet attack on the United States would wipe out the entire government and kill 65% of the American people, he acknowledged that it would literally be a business of digging ourselves out of the ashes and starting again. Shortly thereafter, he reminded a friend that war implies a contest, but what kind of contest it would be when the outlook comes close to the destruction of the enemy and suicide for ourselves. By 1959, he was insisting gloomily that if war ever came, you might as well go out and shoot everyone you see and then shoot yourself, end quote. Eisenhower kind of reminds you of that old Roman saying, quote, "If you want peace, prepare for war," end quote. Historian Garrett Graff writes, quote, "Thermonuclear war had thoroughly frightened Eisenhower. As a staff officer in Panama in the 1920s, Eisenhower had read Karl von Clausewitz's classic On War, which drilled him into the belief that military commanders use every weapon at hand. Wars and military endeavors were unpredictable, irrational, and difficult to control once they started. They escalated in unintended ways, and military commanders would never admit defeat if they still had weapons to deploy. Eisenhower was certain that any war with the Soviet Union would become a nuclear war, and any nuclear war would escalate into a full, all-out general nuclear exchange. To that end, catastrophic to the planet was just too awful to contemplate. During a 1956 meeting, he aggressively confronted members of the cabinet who wanted him to trim back the nation's 5-year strategic stockpile, based on the premise that a war with Russia might last 30 to 60 days. None of his advisors, Eisenhower complained, had withdrawn into private rooms and contemplated the true nature of a thermonuclear war. None of us could imagine the chaos and destruction that such a war would entail. There would be no winner. The best way to stop a small international incident from escalating into a nuclear war was to ensure that everyone understood that all wars would be nuclear. End quote. So to that end, Eisenhower specifically attempted to limit non-nuclear options for future conflicts. He wanted the president to be able to engage in a nuclear first strike without even consulting Congress. He cited studies in which America would experience a complete economic collapse after this kind of a war, regardless of whatever measures were taken. The conditions would last at least for a year. The only way to mitigate the outcome would be to strike first on the sole authority of the president. That means a premeditated nuclear strike on an opponent, and only the president has the authority to do anything about it. He once told a group of congressmen, quote, "Nuclear war will be a very quick thing." And he went on to explain that there would be no time to ask Congress for permission to declare war before issuing orders for a retaliatory strike. He said, quote, "If you were away and I waited on you, you'd start impeachment proceedings against me immediately," end quote. When asked if he would launch a war on his own, he said to a group of reporters, quote, "Yes, the element of surprise, always important in war, has been multiplied by the possibility of creating such widespread destruction quickly. Therefore, any president should be worse than impeached, and he should be hanged immediately if he didn't do what all Americans would demand that he do to protect them in emergency," end quote. You have to like the way this guy is upfront and to the point. I've had a hard time imagining our current president making such a blunt matter of fact statement. Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, a totally fascinating man in his own right, typified this type of thinking in a famous speech from January 1954 when he said, quote, "We need allies and collective security. Our purpose is to make these relations more effective, less costly. This can be done by placing more reliance on deterrent power and less dependence on local defense power. Local defense will always be important, but there needs to be no local defense which alone will contain the mighty land power of the communist world. Local defenses must be reinforced by the further deterrent of massive retaliatory power. A potential aggressor must know that he cannot always prescribe battle conditions that suit him," end quote. So the thing about this massive retaliation policy is that the other side doesn't need to use nuclear weapons themselves in order to initiate a nuclear response. And not just a nuclear response, but like a throw the kitchen sink at you type of response. I mean, it sounds crazy. They might not take your risk all that seriously, but if they feel there's even a 20% chance, would they risk it over something as silly as taking over your little section of Berlin? Maybe if it helps, if they feel you're a little bit off your rocker. I can't say anyone believed that about Eisenhower, but Nixon would definitely adopt that sort of approach with his whole madman philosophy. So John Foster Dulles is an advisor to Truman. He criticized the policy of containment in favor of, quote, liberation. He's a devout Christian who saw communism as a sort of moral blight. He was behind a document called NSC 68. It's basically a policy statement that favored a, quote, rollback of communism rather than just containing it. And it almost endorses like a hooker by crook policy, whatever gets the job done for defeating these guys. It advocates increased military spending in a bunch of areas that Eisenhower wasn't totally cool with. But what it does that makes it really interesting is that it's going to paint Soviet ambitions in just about the dimmest light possible. Basically, they want to expand, and the democracies of the world are in their crosshairs. There are so many different variables that make this a totally hair-raising time to run the United States, or just about any. Or to be alive, really. Not only did you have the hydrogen bomb, with this literally thousands of times more destructive than your original fission weapons, the first hydrogen bomb clocked in at 10 megatons, which is a word they had to invent. Megatons, like it wasn't even used. 1 million tons of TNT. There's going to be another word that gets invented that's called a mega death. That is a unit of 1 million people killed in a nuclear exchange. You have these new weapons delivery systems. Before 1953, if the Soviet Union wanted to drop a bomb on the United States or its allies, they'd have to put those bombs into planes that fly for at least 8 to 12 hours across the Arctic on what are going to be assumed to be suicide missions. This is something we kind of touched on a little bit in the first episode. Most likely they would go after Western European assets or the Middle East or Asia, but intercontinental ballistic missile technology is going to change all of that. This has to be a crazy thing to wake up to. If you are an everyday person in the United States, your whole concept of war is something that's very distant. No one had really mounted a serious attack on the United States since the 1770s, really. Now it could be attacked with thermonuclear weapons in the megaton range. And in all likelihood, since it was assumed a first strike to maximize surprise would probably happen at night, this is something that could happen in your sleep. By the time you're aware of your plight, you might just have minutes to spare, and there would, in all likelihood, be nowhere to go, especially if you lived in a major city or target area. People are very dubious about their chances of survival. The only thing you can do is just wrap your arms around your family and just pray that you aren't incinerated as you watch the minute hand of the clock just move slowly to the next round number. I don't know whether it was just callousness or maybe pragmatism, but Strategic Air Command, SAC, stood doggedly behind the football maxim, the best defense is a good offense, or maybe Napoleon's, he who hides behind his defenses is already lost. To his credit, when grandiose sums were spent on building a concrete bunker and a steel nuclear attack-proof command center 40 feet below the plains of Omaha, Curtis LeMay complained about wasting all of that money in a hole in the ground. He thought the only rational response would just be to build more bombers. He said, quote, "In the nuclear age, it made little sense to waste money playing defense. If the Soviets launched an attack with 200 bombers and American forces somehow managed to shoot down 90% of those planes, the United States would still be hit by 20 H-bombs," end quote. He wanted to be able to hit the Soviet planes on the ground. Congress is going to appropriate $900 million for more of these long-range bombers. By the end of the 1950s, the U.S. is going to have 2,000 long-range bombers, and the Soviets are only going to have 150. However, when it became clear the ICBMs are going to be the future, he sought a monopoly in that as well. While the U.S. is going to build an impressive ground-to-air nuclear-tipped defense missile system called the Nike Hercules, I mean, what help would that be against a warhead with a terminal velocity of 20,000 miles an hour? So to that effect, the U.S. began work on something called the Atlas missile in 1954. It's going to fly successfully in 1957, and then there would be many others. There would be the Atlas missile, believe it or not, is going to be the rocket that is going to put American astronauts into space. But for now, it's meant to rain death on the Soviet Union. There's going to be others like the Jupiter, the Thor, the Titan, and then finally, the most reliable missile is going to be the Minuteman. And then all of these intercontinental ballistic missiles are going to be under the auspices of SAC. So the United States and her NATO allies had a massive advantage in just about every area of nuclear war over the Soviets up until the mid-1950s. But poor intelligence really clouded reality. It didn't help that Nikita Khrushchev, the new premier of the Soviet Union, was basically a first-class BSer. You know, this guy is a real piece of work. Stalin died in 1953. Most of his cronies sort of dropped like flies. Most notably Lavrentiy Beria, the hated guy who runs the secret police. If you haven't seen the movie Death of Stalin, please, you have to. I just love the guy that plays him. Khrushchev is part of this inner circle, but the whole time he really does his best to distance himself from the dictator and his crimes by basically saying that he wasn't responsible and that it's these other people. He's going to embark on a campaign of what's going to be called de-Stalinization. He's going to denounce the imprisonments, the murders, pretty much everything that his predecessor and his patron did, while still attempting to hold the Soviet Union's own in the international stage. I mean, you have to give him credit. It's almost like he's trying to pull off his own version of massive retaliation, but when it comes to what the Soviets really have, like, there's actually nothing to retaliate with. At this point, and this is a very closely guarded secret, the USSR only has about 120 outmoded fission gravity bombs in the arsenal, and there's absolutely no way to hit targets in the mainland U.S. or even Western Europe. I mean, if you're going to be real about it. Khrushchev, when he comes to power in 1953, is going to engage in a massive crash-building program that's going to culminate with the largest man-made explosion in history, the Tsar Bomba. But that won't be until 1961. This guy is cagey. He's a risk taker. He's got this flamboyant personality. I mean, when you compare him with pretty much every other head of state in the USSR, I mean, they're usually dull as dishwater. I mean, even Stalin, if you watch this guy speak in public, there's really nothing to see. This guy is just a gem to watch. If you ever seen, like, Benito Mussolini, the way he throws his arms around and stuff, like, this guy's almost like maybe a toned down communist version of that. It's like Eisenhower. He also loves calculated risks, but unlike Eisenhower, he's bluffing, but he doesn't even have a pair of clubs. as we're going to see, he just keeps upping the ante and upping the ante and upping the ante, which, again, that's great if it works. But, I mean, sooner or later, you're going to have to show your hand. And when you're dealing with a potential nuclear exchange, that can be very costly. Okay, so check out his backstory. This was from a visit to California, actually to Hollywood. This is Khrushchev actually speaking here. Quote, I started working as soon as I learned to walk. Until the age of 15, I worked as a shepherd. I tended, as the foreigners say when they use the Russian language, the little cows. I was a sheep herder. I herded cows for a capitalist, and that was before I was 15. After that, I worked at a factory for a German, and I worked in a French-owned mine, and I worked at a Belgian-owned chemical factory, and now I'm Prime Minister of the great Soviet state. And I'm in no way ashamed of my past because it is all worthy of respect. Work cannot be dirty. It is only conscience that can be. End quote. You almost wish that Khrushchev could have come to power while Truman was still in office, because Truman, he had that same sort of humble background. Truman famously was a haberdasher, and apparently his business failed, and he just sort of found his way into politics, and he moved his way up from there. But Khrushchev, totally uneducated. I mean, this guy was like shoveling poop, at one point in his life, and just circumstances allowed him to kind of move up in the world. He has this sort of intelligence, but it's not like the kind of thing that, you learn from someone. A lot of the early Russian revolutionaries were educated people, but a lot of them were not. And that's Khrushchev. So during the Russian Civil War, of course, Russian Civil War, I mean, we are going to cover that in this podcast, but it's not going to be for a while. He's going to fall in with the Bolsheviks, and he's going to become a protege of a guy by the name of Lazar Kaganovich. Somehow, unlike so many other people, he managed to avoid Stalin's purges, despite admitting some loyalty to Trotsky, which is usually lethal, but it's kind of weird. If you admitted that you were somehow allied with one of Stalin's rivals, but you do it really quick, Stalin might give you credit for being honest, or at the same time, he might just take you out and have you shot. I guess he lucked out on that one. He is denounced, but fortunately nothing is going to stick. He will survive the Second World War, but his son Leonid didn't. Leonid is shot down, and there is some speculation that his son had collaborated with the Germans and then later is executed by Stalin. He later reflected on the whole episode, quote, Stalin called everyone who didn't agree with him an enemy of the people. He said that they wanted to restore the old order, and for his purpose, the enemies of the people had linked up with the forces of reaction internationally. As a result, 700,000 honest people perished. Everyone lived in fear in those days. Everyone expected that at any moment there would be a knock on the door in the middle of the night, and that knock on the door might prove fatal. People not to Stalin's liking were annihilated. Honest party members, irreproachable people, loyal and hard workers for our cause, who had gone through the school of revolutionary struggle under Lenin's leadership. This was utter and complete arbitrariness. And now all this is to be forgiven and forgotten? Never. End quote. In 1956, he is going to, in front of a party congress, give something called the secret speech, which it lasts for hours, but here's just a little excerpt. Quote, it is here that Stalin showed a whole series of cases of his intolerance, his brutality, and his abuse of power. He often shows a path of repression and physical annihilation, not only against actual enemies, but also against individuals who had not committed any crimes against the party or the Soviet government. End quote. this was not meant to be released to the general public, and this is supposed to be kind of like, an inside thing. Unfortunately, it leaked to the New York Times, and what resulted are going to be riots in Poland, in Georgia, the Russia, Georgia, not them. And it ends up being a real source of embarrassment for his regime. Nonetheless, he eliminated the draconian legal troikas of Stalin. The troikas are basically it's almost like a flying court-martial kind of thing where, you'd have three judges and they would just sort of pass summary judgment on, people accused of a crime. It's a far cry from the kind of trial system that we're used to, but he attempted to streamline Soviet agriculture, reform the educational system, but still, on the other hand, he ordered the churches that had been actually allowed to open under Stalin. There was like a kind of a limited resurgence of religion. They closed. He's going to ban religious pilgrimages, Eucharist to children over the age of 4. And he ordered the arrest of the clergy. The Soviet government had a real, kind of an awkward relationship with religion. Early in the revolution, there's going to be a widespread persecution of religious belief throughout the Soviet Union. And there was actually a good deal of backlash because traditionally Russians had been devout Orthodox Christians. So for the rest of the Soviet Union, formally religion is sort of verboten, but a lot of people still kind of practice it anyway. All right, well, we're not concerned with that. Khrushchev really longed to be in the same league with the United States in just about every respect. So during the Suez Crisis in 1956, you get this situation where Britain, France, Israel, they're going to seize the Suez Canal to hopefully overthrow the Soviet-leaning Egyptian president Gamal Nasser. Khrushchev is going to threaten Britain and France with, quote, rocket weapons if they didn't back down. Then when they did, I guess he thinks to himself, like, that's actually really cool. Like, I can sort of get what I want with just sort of threatening to use these nuclear weapons. I think I'm going to maybe try that one again. Historian John Lewis Gaddis writes, from 1957 through 1961, Khrushchev openly, repeatedly, and blood-curdlingly threatened the West with nuclear annihilation. Soviet missile capabilities were so far superior to those of the United States, he insisted, that he could wipe out any American or European city. He would even specify how many missiles and warheads each target might require. But he also tried to be nice about it. At one point, while bullying an American visitor, Hubert Humphrey, he paused to ask where his guest was from. When Humphrey pointed out Minneapolis on the map, Khrushchev circled it with a big blue pencil. "That's so I don't forget to order them to spare the city when the rockets fly," he explained amiably. End quote. He came to believe that this type of bluffing might actually translate into real gains. We'll see in Cuba when he gets to Cuba that's going to be a real problem. But in the near term, he's sort of convinced that maybe if he could play his cards right, he might be able to pick off Berlin. I mean, that would be an absolutely huge propaganda victory. You remember what happened with Joseph Stalin back in 1948. A lot of people question Khrushchev's leadership abilities. Of course, he is going to face an internal coup from the Politburo. The only reason he sticks on is because of the support of the military. You're going to see former premiers, Georgy Malenkov, Vyacheslav Molotov's, even his former mentor, I guess you could say, Lazar Koganovich, all are going to attempt to gang up on him. And, there's a lot of, I guess you could say, bad feeling about the way he sort of aired out Stalin, this whole de-Stalinization program that he had. It's seen as being a little bit too far, even outside of the Soviet Union. Mao, of all people, apparently was a really big fan of Joseph Stalin, and he's going to come to fear that perhaps one day what happened to Stalin is going to happen to his legacy. He puts himself in this position where he almost has to kind of like overcompensate for it. I mean, that's the feeling that I get. Khrushchev is going to say, this is according to John Lewis Gaddis, now that we have the transcontinental missile, he had early explained to Mao, we hold America by the throat as well. They thought America was beyond reach, but that's not true. Berlin, he told his advisors, was the Achilles heel of the West. It was the American foot in Europe that had a sore blister on it. Later, he would use a more startling anatomical metaphor. Berlin is the testicles of the West. Every time I want to make the West scream, I give a squeeze on Berlin, end quote. On the other hand, though, he was a believer, although he didn't always say so in public, that coexistence with the West was possible. Unlike Stalin, who basically thought World War III was a foregone conclusion, he even temporarily halted nuclear testing in 1958. He makes this really awesome, trip to the United States. I mean, this is the first time any Soviet leader has really done this, and he's almost giddy. He says, quote, "This is incredible," he told his son Sergei. "Today, they have to take us into account. It is our strength that led to this. They have to recognize our existence and our power. Who would have thought the capitalists would invite me, a worker?" End quote. From the very beginning, he's impressed by a bunch of just little things that he thinks somehow is just evidence of the greatness of the Soviet state. Like, for instance, when he flies to America, he's just overjoyed to learn that there isn't, I guess, a gangway tall enough to reach up to the plane that he's going to be stepping off of. And he's like, well, that's just because, we're so much better. Of course, the reason why the planes were as high as they were is because all Soviet runways just had a ton of gravel and debris. So typically they had to be farther up off the ground. He's going to get an invite to Camp David, and he has no idea what the heck Camp David is. It's like, Eisenhower invited me to a summer camp, and initially he kind of like takes it as an insult. Evan Thomas's book, Ike's Bluff, describes it thus, quote, "He was a little suspicious about Camp David. Camp David? What sort of camp is that?" After speculating that it was like Camp Principo, an island on the Black Sea where stray dogs are sent to die. He was reassured when he was told that it was the president's vacation dacha. When crowds did not cheer his motorcade, he speculated that they had been ordered to remain silent. At a state dinner, when Ike's favorite band, Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians, played Zippity Doo-Dah, Khrushchev offered a toast. "It is true that you are richer than we are at present, but tomorrow we will be as rich as you are. The next day, even richer. But is there anything wrong with this?" He met Nelson Rockefeller, Marilyn Monroe, asked to visit Disneyland, but was refused for security reasons. Apparently, he spoke so often of nuclear war that the Russian translator began using a little mushroom cloud as a form of shorthand symbol in his notebook. At a breakfast the following day, Khrushchev related how he opposed Stalin in World War II and tried to stop him from wasting too many lives in frontal assaults against the Germans. Eisenhower was not quite sure what Khrushchev was getting at, that he and Eisenhower were fellow old soldiers standing up to reckless politicians, or that Khrushchev had defied Stalin so he could surely defy Eisenhower. Later, Eisenhower related that during a walk, Khrushchev had refused to lift his demand that the West get out, that next day, Khrushchev would give Ike's grandchildren little red stars and Christmas ornaments depicting Soviet missiles striking the moon, end quote. So the most famous of these Khrushchev interactions has to be the one where he meets Vice President Richard Nixon, and Nixon's trying to show off a sort of model kitchen full of household items that any American could afford. It's all part of this joint cultural exhibition that's basically supposed to showcase the cultural and scientific achievements of both sides. He's basically going to poke around this little mock kitchen and he's going to say, quote, "This is what America is capable of. And how long has she existed? 300 years? 150 years of independence? And this is her level. We haven't quite reached 42 years. And in another 7 years, we'll be at the level of America. And after that, we'll go further," end quote. In reality, when it comes to consumer goods, I mean, that is truly the Soviet weak spot. Years later, Boris Yeltsin on a trip to the United States is going to just randomly tell his driver to just go off the track, away from the minders and everything. And he's going to walk into a supermarket and he's apparently just going to be dumbfounded. He gets back in the car and then for about 45 minutes, he just doesn't say anything. He's just stone-faced. And then he just shakes his head, puts his head in his hands, and he's like, "We have failed the Soviet people." At this point, however, though, I mean, Khrushchev is a BSer, but at the same time, you do get the feeling that he really does believe in communism. If it only gets the chance that it needs, perhaps the Soviet Union is going to be capable of everything that, they are promising their citizens. I mean, as for right now, though, it's almost like that maxim, fake it till you make it. Khrushchev is just known for his bravado. He's going to make a boast, quote, this is probably the most famous one that I think he did, quote, "About the capitalist states, it doesn't depend on whether or not we exist. If you don't like us, don't accept our invitations, and don't invite us to come to see you. Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you," end quote. Later, he's going to sort of walk that back a little bit, maybe. I don't know what to make of this. Quote, "We do not agree with your widely quoted phrase, 'We shall bury you.' You shall not bury us, and we shall not bury you. We are happy with our way of life. We recognize its shortcomings and are always trying to improve. But if challenged, we shall fight to the death to preserve it," end quote. Many Americans are going to interpret this particular quote as a nuclear threat. Then there's the even more infamous claim, and this one you probably have heard before. He has this weird sort of exchange with Mayor Norris Paulson of Los Angeles, in which he, in this kind of back and forth, shouting match, he says, quote, "We are turning out missiles like sausages," end quote. Now, the trouble with a head of state like this, running a state as opaque as the Soviet Union, is that outside of some real, insider information, it's almost impossible to know whether to take him at his word or not. Throughout the Cold War, the U.S. would have great expertise when it came to technological surveillance, but when it came to old-fashioned boots-on-the-ground spy work, they're absolutely miserable. I mean, remember, spy satellites are really not going to come into picture until, 1958 or more realistically, 1959. At this point, there's this wide division between those who think the Soviets are in the process of building the means to annihilate the West, or maybe they're far behind in a game of catch-up. Of course, when politics gets involved and you want something to club the administration with, hyping up a bomber gap or later some the really worrisome missile gap, might just be fear-mongering, or it might be based in reality, or it might just be old-fashioned cynical politics as usual. Nonetheless, there is going to be a huge push to develop American missile technology at this point. It gets thrown out into overdrive when a Russian ICBM puts the first man-made satellite in space. This is October 4th, 1957. You don't have to use your imagination to see how the public might view that. I mean, if they can put that thing, this little beeping thing, over our heads and we can't figure out how to do the same, we must be in serious trouble. You're going to have ham radio operators that are literally going to hear it as it flew by every day. Everybody is looking up into the sky, trying to maybe possibly catch a glimpse at it. That particular Soviet ICBM was an R-7 Semyorka. Purportedly, it could carry a warhead up to 5,500 miles. That it put a beeping object in space, it just cannot be underestimated. It had flown 3,700 miles already in a test that August. They had started production of that missile in 1953. The U.S. had been at it since 1946, and the Soviets had already beaten us, it seemed. Fred Kaplan writes, quote, "A Russian rocket launched into orbit in outer space that day. A Russian rocket, the very notice that the Russians, previously thought of as a primitive Asiatics when it came to advanced technology, could beat the United States of America in something so ultimately technological as the launching of an object into outer space was absolutely horrifying, a threat to national security in its own right. It was an event that evoked hysterical public pronouncements. John Reinhardt of the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory proclaimed that no matter what we do now, the Russians will beat us to the moon. I would not be surprised if Russians had reached the moon within a week. Edward Teller, father of the H-bomb, declared on national television that America had lost a battle more important than Pearl Harbor." End quote. Eisenhower's political opponents just seized on the event. Senator John F. Kennedy stated that, quote, "the nation was losing the satellite missile race with the Soviet Union because of complacent miscalculations, penny pinching, budget cutbacks, incredibly confused mismanagement, and wasteful rivalries and jealousies," end quote. In his book, A Fiery Peace in a Cold War, author Neil Sheehan describes how even Curtis LeMay, who is probably the most obstinate advocate for building these massive bomber fleets, was just outdone by this newcomer, General Bernard Shriver. He proved that the Soviets were developing surface-to-air missiles that would knock LeMay's bombers out of the sky, and the only answer is to go ahead to just go whole hog into this new technology. In 1955, he had gone right to the top. Apparently, Eisenhower will say, "Most impressive. There's no question this weapon will have a profound impact on all aspects of human life, military, sociological, and political." The president would order the Pentagon to build these missiles with maximum urgency. There would be something called the Gaither Committee a month after Sputnik in Congress that showed that technology was inadequate for defense against the first strike. More offensive and defensive missiles. It called for a whopping 50% increase in defense spending. Most troubling, it said that the Soviets had blown out the U.S. in ICBM research and development. The report would make a shocking claim that a Soviet missile attack could kill half the American population. It claimed that civil defense efforts would be mostly futile. That it would say that there is in reality no defense but to retaliate. If the Soviets struck first, there would be nothing to do but absorb the blow and hit back with whatever was left over. And that would be, of course, a second strike capability. Fred Kaplan is going to write this, quote, But the leading voices on the Gaither Committee were adamant in sticking to the more aggressive line of argument. Jerry Wiesner of the steering panel and Herbert York of Livermore Labs and the Gaither staff had a constant line on the issue. What's important, they would say, is not what the Soviets might do, it's what they could do. And there was a very palpable sense, a sense of dread urgency, that once the Soviets attained the ability to launch a first strike, then they very might well go ahead and launch, end quote. So I think you can see how in this environment with all this fear and apprehension, the pressure to build more and more of these weapons of mass destruction would just be immense. You already have massive fleets of bombers. You have missiles all over Europe, in the Middle East, East Asia, North America. It's all in response to the fact that the Soviet Union looks like it may have the capacity to wipe out the Europeans and our allies. Kennedy would say in 1958, quote, "Our nation could have afforded and can afford now the steps necessary to close the missile gap." One of the key planks in his election campaign is going to be that Republicans were, quote, "weak on defense and that we could close the missile gap," end quote. He would go further in a speech the following year. This is from Kaplan again. Quote, "In a speech delivered in April 1959, Kennedy pinpointed the main problem in our missile defense posture as the problem of protecting our striking power, making it more secure against enemy attack. He emphasized that even if the missile gap were somehow ended and our supply of ICBMs were equal to that of the Soviets, we would still be on the short end of the deterrent ratio." Taking a page from Wohlstetter's Delicate Balance of Terror, the candidate noted that there's no security in merely matching the first strike forces of the Soviets. The real question is, how large will our force be after the first Russian strike? How secure is it against destruction? End quote. So the Soviets capitalized on their strengthened position with false alarms of missile capabilities. They're going to claim on December 4th, 1958 that quote, "Soviet ICBMs are at present in mass production," end quote. 5 days later, Khrushchev is going to boast about successful testing of an ICBM within an 8,000-mile range. When you couple this with the U.S.'s failed launch of the Titan ECBM, that same month, there's this sense that there's this huge inferiority when it comes to Soviet missile technology. It wasn't known at the time, but the Soviets were tricking the West into believing that they were much, much, much stronger than they were. Same thing happened with the bomber gap from about 5 years earlier. And this is really great. I love this. Apparently at an Aviation Day parade in 1955, they would take 28 of their new intercontinental Bison bombers and just fly them in a loop, each time in a different formation to basically fool observers into thinking that there were just hundreds and hundreds. And they're going to pull the same trick with the missiles. So the Air Force is going to claim that by 1962, the Soviets might have like a whopping 500 or even 1,000 ICBMs. I mean, the U.S. would only have 24 Atlas missiles ready to go by 1960 and 65 by 1961. However, despite all the doom and gloom, the CIA is starting to draw some different conclusions. So this whole thing with the missile gap, it's almost like an article of faith, but at some point you really need to see them. And no one had actually really seen a Soviet ICBM, but you can tell when they're testing them. There's all sorts of infrared sensors and radar, and the amount of actual Soviet missile testing had actually decreased by the summer of 1958. It's sort of like a dilemma of negative evidence. How long do you wait for something to happen before you conclude that maybe it's just not going to happen? In reality, the Soviets were having a very rough time building missiles that could hit the United States. In one shocking disaster, a missile exploded on a launch pad in 1960. This was known as the Nedeline catastrophe. 100 people were incinerated, including a high-ranking general who insisted on sitting on a chair like just 100 feet away from this thing as it was launching. You can actually see this on YouTube, and it's really horrifying, like people running around on fire. Just brace yourself. Khrushchev must have known he was putting himself in a very awkward position, because America is getting good at building weapons of mass destruction. And through his dishonesty, he's just throwing fuel on the fire. So at this point, at the Rand Corporation, you have an interesting theory championed by this ex-Princeton international studies professor named William Kaufman. It's called counterforce. He's basically picking up on the work that Bernard Brodie had done earlier on game theory. The idea is, what if you could attack the Soviets and destroy their capacity to launch a nuclear strike, but then leave the major population centers untouched? Kaufman is interesting because he's not really a math science wonk like the others. He's taking a psychological approach. The idea is that if you were to hit everything, especially cities, then the other side would hit your cities since they have nothing left to lose. Another idea he had was based on a study from World War II where apparently rumors in this Czech town named Warbow that the British were about to bomb sort of spread. And despite rumors to the contrary, like everybody evacuated. And the Nazis couldn't get people to come back to their jobs, and it caused a ton of disruption. So maybe just threatening to use nuclear weapons would be almost as bad as using them, and you really wouldn't kill anybody. So, it's a really interesting idea. A lot of the work done by Rand in the mid-1950s centered around targeting. When bombs were only a few really large, clunky Mark IVs or Fives, and they were only deliverable by these lumbering bombers. Cities were really the only realistic targets. But now, with numerous different planes and now missiles, an attack could concentrate on an enemy's war-making capacity. But it gets complicated because now you have all sorts of options. Which weapons? Which delivery options? Since thermonuclear weapons are going to have blast radiuses that are miles wide, one weapon can now hit several targets. How can that job be done more efficiently? I mean, what's the circular error probability, or how off a target can a weapon be and still be effective in terms of damage? And then at this point, you have weapons that can explode in the midair, or they can explode when they hit the ground. And these are all questions that have to be addressed. Many of the more senior Air Force commanders sort of recoiled at the idea of anything less than shooting off the entire stockpile or sparing cities. Another counterforce proponent, James Loftus, found himself on the receiving end of some frustration from a director of SAC intelligence. Kaplan describes the encounter, quote, "The more Loftus thought about it, the more he realized that the Air Force, and especially SAC, were more interested not in counterforce, but in mass destruction. The first time Loftus went out to SAC headquarters in Omaha, General Jim Walsh, director of SAC intelligence, had invited him over to his house for cocktails. As they entered the foyer, Loftus noticed a huge Bible on an end table just to the side of the entrance. Walsh was in the middle of a frequently delivered mini-lecture, explaining to Loftus that the big bomb was meant for big damage. 'God damn it, Loftus,' he screamed. 'There's only one way to attack the Russians, and that's to hit them hard with everything we have.' And at this point, pounding his fist on top of the Bible, 'knock their balls off,' end quote. But despite the static, these guys are just going to chug away. So other counterforce recommendations were putting planes and missiles in hardened silos, dispersing SAC assets so it wouldn't be kind of an all the eggs in one basket situation, investing in early warning radar. Using game theory, they attempted to game out how the Soviets might attempt to protect their own assets and then how they'd respond to U.S. measures. Quote, but what if we didn't blow up Soviet cities at all? What if we executed a counterforce attack in retaliation to a Soviet invasion of Western Europe? Not only would that strike at the very heart of the Soviet military power, but it might serve as a more credible deterrent to such an invasion in the first place. If we did not strike at Soviet cities, perhaps the Soviets would strike back at something other than American cities. And if therefore American cities were not placed at so much risk in the act of defending Western Europe, then America's commitment to NATO alliance would be made more credible, which was to Kaufman the object of preeminent importance. So maybe a nuclear war, while wildly destructive, might be something that can be controlled. I mean, after all, warfare has rules and traditions that go basically back as old as time. I mean, total wars of annihilations have been the historical exception, not the rule. Nonetheless, hitting protected military targets with high yield weapons would mean much greater fallout, which would kill millions of civilians. I mean, on the other hand, at least major population centers wouldn't be smoking ruins. If you keep a reserve force, then those untouched cities can be kind of used as bargaining chips in the future. Okay, so that leads us to Herman Kahn. He's definitely my favorite one of these Rand eggheads. This guy strikes you like the archetype of a polymath. I mean, he would just be a really interesting guy to have a conversation with. You definitely would want to have him over for dinner. I mean, just look at his Wikipedia. He's a preeminent, a futurist, which, well, I mean, it's kind of what it sounds like. Definitely the kind of person you'd want in a think tank. He's trained in political science at Yale. He studied nuclear physics at Caltech and UCLA. He actually helped Edward Teller design the H-bomb. He thought the Air Force plan to blast everything in the Soviet Union was dumb, saying, quote, "Gentlemen, you don't have a war plan. You have a wargasm." That's so good. He came up with this idea of a doomsday machine. Yet this is where Dr. Strangelove, the whole idea for like that movie came from. Kaplan writes, quote, with mock sincerity, Kahn proposed what he called a doomsday machine. It would be a vast computer wired up to a huge stockpile of H-bombs. When the computer sensed that the Soviet Union had committed an act defined as intolerable, the machine would automatically set off the doomsday bombs, covering the Earth with sufficient radioactive fallout to kill billions of people. Along with an engineer at Rand, Kahn figured out that on paper, such a doomsday machine was technologically feasible. End quote. Now, I don't want to jump too far ahead in the story, but believe it or not, although Kahn wasn't serious, the Soviets actually will devise a doomsday machine. It's not going to really become a reality until the 1980s, but yes, there is an almost totally automated system that would basically launch every single missile in the Soviet arsenal if there was a sort of decapitation attack. But we will get to that later. What I like the best about Kahn's work is that you really get the feeling that he understands how conflict work. When people get in a fight or an argument, there's almost always sort of like a back and forth exchange of moves and counter moves. Escalation moves to a certain point and then it de-escalates. I mean, if you've ever been a middle schooler or seen a middle schooler fight, you probably know what I'm talking about. I mean, the school bully wins because he can control escalation. If you hit him back, he will wallop you. So he knows that he doesn't have to wallop most kids. So according to Kahn, there are different types of deterrence. There's type 1, massive retaliation. I can smash you at any given point if you cross that line. There's type 2 deterrence, which is sort of a credible first strike. It's the other side simply knowing that you can hit and destroy them at any time and they won't be able to get a blow in. And then there's type 3 deterrence. That's sort of a tit for tat. Cross that line and I'll do the same to you. And then it'll keep going and it's not worth it. So to control a nuclear war, one needs to have type 2 and type 3 deterrence pretty much mastered. Quote, if the Soviet aggressor is reasonable, Kahn would write, he would avoid the defender's cities, civilians, and recuperative capacity in order to maximize his post-attack blackmail threats. He will attack or threaten attack America's SAC bases. Then he would use his remaining weapons as blackmail devices, telling us in effect that if we fired back at Soviet cities, he would use the Soviet reserve force to clobber our cities, which is all we could do if we only had type 1 deterrence, end quote. He also believed that civil defense, particularly the ability to evacuate cities, would give a state an advantage and even engage if first strikes if need be. Quote, any power that can evacuate a high percentage of its urban population to protection, Kahn wrote, is in a much better position to bargain than one that cannot do this. Indeed, international politics of the 1960s and beyond would be so racked with tension and crises that, to Kahn's mind, it was perfectly conceivable that the U.S. might have to evacuate 2 or 3 times every decade. In fact, Kahn felt that having a good civil defense system made the act of going to the nuclear brink an altogether salutary thing to do on occasion. To those both in and out of Rand who objected that this credible first strike capability might convert a limited peripheral war into a strategic nuclear war, Kahn responded, insofar as the civil defense program gives us the ability to convert at our discretion, it should be a good thing, end quote. He dreamed up this elaborate nuclear shelter program with an estimated cost of like $700 a space, like 1,000 feet underground, able to withstand 1,000-pound square inch blast, fast closing doors. He thought that, you could utilize mine shafts. They would all be stocked with a multi-year food supply. I mean, the works. Of course, the cost would be astronomical, but it would put you in a better bargaining position for a first strike. And what makes Kahn even more interesting is that because he didn't stay off in some sort of obscure ivory tower, he delivered countless lectures, not just to military people, but to like community and civic groups. He's gonna be. He's apparently a pretty funny guy. He would make jokes all the time. He'd point to all these charts and graphs, comparing numbers of fatalities under different wartime conditions. He had whole talks about, philosophical questions like, will the survivors envy the dead? And tragic but distinguishable post-war states. 5,000 people came out to hear these talks, and he's eventually going to write a 652-page book called On Thermonuclear War, which apparently sold 30,000 copies in hardcover. That sounds like a great gift idea, by the way. Chris is got, here's a copy of On Thermonuclear War. Well, I would like it. Anyway, that'll make for some interesting conversation, as you sip your eggnog and eat ham. I don't know. Here's a passage, quote, now just imagine yourself in the post-war situation. Everybody will have been subjected to the extremes of anxiety, unfamiliar environment, strange foods, minimum toilet facilities, inadequate shelters, and the like. Under these conditions, some high percentage of the population is going to become nauseated, and nausea is very contagious. If one man vomits, everybody vomits. It would not be surprising if almost everybody vomits. Almost everyone is likely to think that he has received too much radiation. Morale may be affected so that many survivors may refuse to participate in constructive activities, but would content themselves with sitting down and waiting to die. Some may even become violent and destructive. However, the situation would be quite different if radiation meters are distributed. Imagine now a man gets sick from a cause other than radiation. Not believing this, his morale begins to drop. You look at this meter and say, you have received only 10 rentigens. Why are you vomiting? Pull yourself together and get to work. End quote. Kahn, of course, rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and there was plenty of blowback. He also overlooked some obvious consequences of a nuclear exchange, like the state collapsing or becoming a tyranny, or the economy functioning, the survival of a pre-war value system, bottlenecks in things like food or energy or anything essential. He also got like comically wonky at times. He had this idea that food contaminated with strontium-90 could be put in different classes before giving it to the public. So class A would be the cleanest, just for children and pregnant women. Class B, it would be high priced but available to all. Class C, low priced but available to all. Class D, only available to people over 40. So gosh, all right. So I guess I'm stuck in that category. And Class E would be animal consumption. What you have to like about Herman Kahn is that he really thinks through all the potential realities of a nuclear event. And he doesn't slip into, oh, we're all screwed, don't even bother thinking about it, or it's stupid not to just chuck everything you have at the other guy. He really is an intellectual. Not just the logistical realities of this post-nuclear exchange world, but like the psychological and even philosophical ramifications mean something. And keep in mind, he's writing at a time about as far removed from the horrors of the Second World War as, you know, for us, the Obama presidency, or maybe the death of bin Laden. I mean, these memories are all so fresh. I mean, this is a generation that's scarred by war. I mean, the Iraq War is farther removed from us than Hiroshima is for him. He's asking us, what does it mean to be human in this new era? I mean, if you can fault him for anything, it's that at times he can be too optimistic or even whimsical. But, you know, maybe in his day you could think that way, I mean, and do so realistically, and then maybe not. In the end, he's just an interesting man who makes you go, I think there was a song by that name. Anyway, I don't know. Things that make you go, Okay, so that'll just about wrap it up for us today. Before we wrap up the podcast, I would really like to just please, I'd beg of you, if you enjoyed the podcast, please, leave a nice 5-star rating. Put in a review on Apple Podcasts. It would really mean a lot to me, and it would help this show kind of maybe, gain a bigger audience. Well, anyway, enough of that. Next time on Savage Continent, the PSYOP is finally constructed. The actual plan to obliterate the Sino-Soviet bloc is formulated. How did it happen? What were these pencil pushers thinking as they so lovingly crafted the end of humanity with such mathematical precision? And trust me, this plan really, it's a piece of beauty in its own way. Then, how did this plan come actually and realistically within a whisker of taking place? It was close. How did 2 bearded men wandering through the jungles of Cuba just 3 years earlier nearly bring the world to nuclear Armageddon? All this and more next time on Savage Continent.